travel along Catholic pilgrims for 1 year as we read through St. Faustina's diary. Join me, Amy Thomas, each day for a short reading out of the diary which brought us a deeper understanding of Christ's divine mercy. Here we are at day 47 of our readings from St. Faustina's diary. So, we are trucking along, Catholic pilgrims, day 47. Every day I feel like I get more and more out of her writings, and I also feel like I'm starting to kind of get the flow of her writings and a deeper sense of who she is. She's starting to seem, more like a real person. I think sometimes the saints seem far away in a distant land and are just kind of people from made up stories, but they were actually real people. And I feel like the further we go in reading her diary, the more she is coming alive to me and seems like, a real person. I know she was a real person, but she's just becoming more real to me. So today's readings are from Notebook 1, numbers 150 through 153. I want to write down a dream that I had about St. Therese of the Child Jesus. I was still a novice at the time and was going through some difficulties which I did not know how to overcome. They were interior difficulties connected with exterior ones. I made novenas to various saints, but the situation grew more and more difficult. The sufferings it caused me were so great that I did not know how to go on living, but suddenly the thought occurred to me that I should pray to St. Therese of the Child Jesus. I started a novena to this saint because before entering the convent I had had a great devotion to her. Lately, I had somewhat neglected this devotion, but in my need, I began again to pray with great fervor. On the 5th day of the novena, I dreamed of St. Therese, but it was as if she were still living on earth. She hid from me the fact that she was a saint and began to comfort me, saying that I should not be worried about this matter, but should trust more in God. She said, I suffered greatly too, but I did not quite believe her and said, It seems to me that you have not suffered at all. But St. Therese answered me in a convincing manner that she had suffered very much indeed, and said to me, Sister, know that in 3 days the difficulty will come to a happy conclusion. When I was not very willing to believe her, she revealed to me that she was a saint. At that moment a great joy filled my soul, and I said to her, You are a saint? Yes, she answered, I am a saint. Trust that this matter will be resolved in 3 days. And I said, Dear sweet Teresa, tell me, shall I go to heaven? And she answered, Yes, you will go to heaven, sister. And will I be a saint? To which she replied, Yes, you will be a saint. But little Therese, shall I be a saint as you are, raised to the altar? And she answered, Yes, you will be a saint just as I am, but you must trust in the Lord Jesus. I then asked her if my mother and father would go to heaven. Unfinished sentence. And she replied that they would. I further asked, And will my brothers and sisters go to heaven? She told me to pray hard for them, but gave me no definite answer. I understood that they were in need of much prayer. This was a dream, and as the proverb goes, dreams are phantoms, God is faith. Nevertheless, 3 days later the difficulty was solved very easily, just as she had said, and everything in this affair turned out exactly as she said it would. It was a dream, but it had its significance. Once when I was in the kitchen with Sister N, she got a little upset with me and, as a punishment, ordered me to sit on the table while she herself continued to work hard at cleaning and scrubbing. And while I was sitting there, the sisters came along and were astounded to find me sitting on the table, and each one had her say. One said that I was a loafer, and another, What an eccentric! I was a postulate at the time. Others said, What kind of a sister will she make? Still, I could not get down because Sister had ordered me to sit there by virtue of obedience until she told me to get down. Truly, God alone knows how many acts of self-denial it took. I thought I'd die of shame. God often allowed such things for the sake of my inner formation, but he compensated me for this humiliation by a great consolation. During benediction, I saw him in great beauty. Jesus looked at me kindly and said, My daughter, do not be afraid of sufferings. I am with you. Once I had night duty, and I was suffering greatly in spirit because of the painting of the image, and I no longer knew which way to turn because they were constantly trying to convince me that the whole thing was an illusion. On the other hand, one priest said that perhaps God wanted to be worshipped through this image, and therefore I ought to try to get it painted. Meanwhile, my soul was becoming extremely exhausted. When I entered the little chapel, I brought my head close to the tabernacle, knocked, and said, Jesus, look at the great difficulties I am having because of the painting of this image. And I heard a voice from the tabernacle, My daughter, your sufferings will not last much longer. One day I saw two roads. One was broad, covered with sand and flowers, full of joy, music, and all sorts of pleasures. People walked along it, dancing and enjoying themselves. They reached the end without realizing it, and at the end of the road there was a horrible precipice, that is, the abyss of hell. The souls fell blindly into it as they walked, so they fell. And their number was so great that it was impossible to count them. And I saw the other road, or rather a path, for it was narrow and strewn with thorns and rocks, and the people who walked along it had tears in their eyes, and all kinds of suffering befell them. Some fell down upon the rocks, but stood up immediately and went on. At the end of the road there was a magnificent garden filled with all sorts of happiness, and all these souls entered there. At the very first instant, they forgot all their sufferings. So a while back in one of the other podcasts, there was some reference made to doing little things with great love, and I commented that, this sounds a lot like St. Therese of the Child Jesus. And then here today we read about how she had a great devotion to her. So that must have been where that was coming from, because it definitely sounded like it came from her. But I think something to talk about today is what we read about in 151. And this is a very interesting little scene here. So she's in the kitchen with this sister, and obviously this sister is of a higher, I guess, rank, for lack of a better word. And so Sister N gets upset with Sister Faustina, and she orders her to sit on the table, and you're going to sit here and you're going to watch me work as your punishment, because don't we all kind of feel guilty when we have to watch somebody else do the work that we should be doing? So anyway, she's sitting there, and some other sisters come along, and they immediately judge the scene. And they're like, oh my gosh, what kind of sister are you going to be, just sitting there on the table, not doing anything, while Sister N is, working her tail off, you're just going to sit there. What an eccentric. Oh my gosh. And Sister Faustina just has to take it, because she's, been told to sit there out of the virtue of obedience, and she can't explain why. She just has to take this humiliation. And she talks about how really hard that was. And thinking of myself, I would have been like, looky here, you don't even know why I'm sitting on this table. I'm sitting here because Sister N got mad at me and I have to sit here out of obedience, so shut your trap. That would be me. Sister Faustina obviously is way more holy than I am, and she was able to hold her tongue. But what this really shows is that so often we miss the context of things. We see one snippet of a scene, and that's all we see, and then we pass quick judgment on it. But we don't know what's happened before the scene when we've entered it. And we see this happen all the time in our lives. We look at people and we see how they are right now in the present day, and we immediately judge everything about them without understanding any context to anything. I've told you before that I was a counselor, and one of the things that it still surprised me every single time somebody would come in to see me, and for the most part they would have their lives were just in shambles. And part of me wanted to always think, oh wow, this is just one of those people who just can't ever get it together. They're just lazy, they won't try, they have no motivation or anything like that. And then as they would start to talk and tell me about their lives, I saw very quickly the context of their life, and I saw why they were at the place that they were right then, and why they appeared to be like super lazy, unmotivated people. And the context just changed my whole thought about them. Now, that's not to say that some people aren't lazy or unmotivated or anything like that, but for a lot of the patients that I saw it changed everything, and I was able to have a bit more compassion for their situation, and it also allowed me to be more helpful to them. So I think that's something that we often miss, is the context of something. And so especially when we're on like social media or we're out in public and we see something, we're all so quick to pass judgment right away. Gosh, I know I am. And we don't give people either the benefit of the doubt, or we don't afford them, the opportunity to explain to us what is going on. So that's just something to keep in mind. The last thing I wanted to touch on was number 153. And what a vivid picture she paints. The two roads. And the one road is like everything you could want. There's dancing, there's joy, there's pleasure. People are just enjoying themselves. Everything is great. And then you look over here at the other path, and it's this rocky, thorny road that people are tripping over the rocks, and they're all crying, and they're just suffering as they go. The people on the happy little trail just fall off into the abyss. They don't even realize it. They don't even see it because they're so consumed with all the pleasures that they're experiencing. And the people on the rocky road, wind up in a beautiful garden. And, I know we've all thought about the two paths. Even Christ tells us one path is very wide, and that would be the happy little path that she talks about. And one path is very narrow, because we don't really want to be on the narrow path because it's so hard. But when we look at the grand scheme of things, when we look at eternity, our lives are very small. And, do we want just the earthly pleasures, which could be 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years? Or do we want pleasures for eternity, which will make our earthly life seem just like a blip? I think so often we forget that our earthly life is not all that there is. And we live so much for the earthly life and maximizing pleasures and, all the wonderful experiences that we can. And that's not to say that trying to have a pleasurable earthly life is bad. But when it becomes an idol, then we will trip off into the abyss. But there's the other path that is, got the rocks and the thorns, and has suffering and trials and sacrifice. And a lot of times we try to avoid that path because it's so uncomfortable. But we have to remember that there is something beyond that path. And it's just really about which would we rather have, a short earthly pleasure or a long eternal pleasure. And it's just something I think we forget about, because we're so focused on, the here and the now, and I want to feel good here and now. So those are just some thoughts that I came across today. I thought this was a really good reading. There's so much I could talk about, but I thought that the number 153 was, again, just, she paints such a incredible picture, and you can totally see it in your head and visualize it. And we just got to know that if we're on the rocky road, there are great things at the end. So just keep on trucking. She even says these souls fell down, but they got up immediately and kept on going. So that has to be us. Finish the race. So I will see you back for day 48 tomorrow, Catholic Pilgrims. And until then, live the faith boldly and travel well.